Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We're gonna wait just 1 minute just to make sure everybody has a chance to log in and get situated. We'll begin in 1 minute. All right, good afternoon. Welcome to the latest installment of Homeroom with Education Leaders. Today's discussion is going to be focused on Voices versus Voters 2024, our Across the Aisle survey. My name is Javaid Siddiqui. I have the good fortune of serving as the president and CEO of the Hunt Institute. For those unfamiliar with the Institute, we were founded by former North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt. We serve as a resource for policymakers on education issues ranging from prenatal all the way to higher education. We offer both in-person and virtual convenings. We conduct research and offer other forms of technical assistance to state leaders from across the country. Before we jump in, I want to provide a brief logistical review of how we'll spend our time together this afternoon. We're going to start with a panel discussion on the findings from the 2024 Across the Aisle survey. And then we'll pivot to some questions and answers from the audience. So please do feel free to log your questions. If you do have questions, we're going to ask you to submit them using our Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're going to be recording this conversation, and in probably the next couple of days, we're going to post it to our YouTube channel for those of you that like to share it. We'd also encourage you to join us on Twitter, where you can participate in our conversation using the hashtag #EdHomeroom. So with that, let's jump in. We're so appreciative of the panelists who are joining us today. The Across the Aisle survey is in its third year of original research aimed at exploring parent and voter priorities in public education. This Hunt Institute project grew out of the COVID constituency during the pandemic years when education leaders, parents, and communities had questions about what the real priorities were for public schools. In 2024, this research can help education leaders to identify key areas of attention as they set agendas for the upcoming terms. Today's conversation, we're going to feature leading experts who will talk about the results from Across the Aisle survey and to what extent these results reflect the outcomes from the election. This conversation is particularly timely with the highly divisive election results. This data brings us hope that we're not as divided on education as our national politics appear to be. To that end, I'm pleased to introduce our speakers today. First, Governor Bob Wise, former governor of West Virginia and longtime partner of the Hunt Institute. Celinda Lake, president of Lake Research Partners, and Bob Carpenter, president of Chesapeake Beach Consulting. Thanks to all of you for joining. And Celinda, I'm going to start with you. What were the key takeaways from this year's Across the Aisle survey? Are there any ideas that challenge current trends or priorities in education?
Well, thank you so much. And it's a great privilege to be working with Hunt. And I want to just really commend Hunt for investing the resources to have a bipartisan team and to have such a fulsome look at white voters, voters of color, conservative voters, teachers, and a nationally representative sample. It's really, really a robust sample. And we are very appreciative of having been able to be part of this effort. I want to acknowledge also Jesse Klein, who is on this call, who is the head of our Hunt team, and a whole host of others, including Alicia Snell, another partner, who are key to this. And it's always great working with Bob and Bob, the two Bobs. So it's very exciting because people are really, I was as depressed and as upset as people are. They're very, very, very committed to education. And if we jump ahead on the slides, And you wouldn't know it, frankly, from the present. This is just the methodology, and it shows you the very robust sampling that we did. 2024 likely voters, and then looking at parents as well. If we look at the next slide and the next slide, voters and parents both want to invest in teachers. Teachers are extremely popular with the public. 82% of voters favor providing resources for teachers. And this is something that has really increased post-COVID. Like when we get, and we'll talk about this a little later, when we get to mental health, people think the teachers and the students need more mental health resources. But mentorship, development opportunities, leadership pathways, so teachers can move into principal and other school leadership positions. 82% favor that, 52% strongly. 70% of voters agree that we should all support our neighborhood public schools, be on the side of teachers, and make things better for all kids. This is super important because remember, only 28% of the electorate has children under 18. So this is an enormous amount of collective agreement that schools and investing in schools should be a priority. 68% of voters strongly agree. This isn't total agree, this is strongly agree that our public school teachers need resources in the classroom that allow for personalized learning, up-to-date textbooks, and technology. Personalized learning really emerged as something that people were interested in post-COVID. Voters and parents want to increase funding for public schools. And we asked the tough question, and this is another thing I commend Anton. They don't just draw a bunch of conclusions from one question, and they don't just ask the easy questions. But would you favor or oppose increasing funding for public schools, even if it increased your taxes, such as property or sales tax? 67% said they favored that. But the intensity is only 35%. People are really tax sensitive right now, and it's making a difference. If we look at the next slide, excuse me, my allergies are bothering me. We looked at school choice and we looked at education savings accounts. People are slightly more favorable toward education safety accounts, savings accounts, 56%, with 29% strongly. A lot of people don't know what an education savings account is, so we described it. And 51% in favor of vouchers. But the intensity here is low. People like money going to the child, but they don't want to particularly raid public schools, and they want to make sure. A lot of people, again, remember, people don't have kids in school. Voters don't. A lot of people just want to have a good public school for every child. Midwesterners more strongly support vouchers. The voters in the West and the Northeast less likely to support them. And finally, we looked at racial diversity. 62% of voters and 66% of parents say their school is diverse. The attitudes are very similar. But diversity, it doesn't have a lot of intensity to it. They think, yeah, there are a lot of different kinds of people in the schools in our local school district, but not a lot of intensity for diversity. 69% of African Americans, 66% of Latinos, 60% of whites, 68% of Asian American Pacific Islanders, and 64% of Native Americans say my school system is diverse. But again, the intensity is quite low. But with that, the contradiction is people don't think diversity is particularly a problem. And they're not particularly concerned about it, particularly when it comes to a diversity of staff. Even though there have been lots of studies out there that show the difference it can make, the public has really lagged behind, and parents have lagged behind in terms of thinking this was a big problem or a big concern. It tends to rank much, much lower. And that includes even with African American parents, who tend to be the most aware of this issue. Let me turn it back to you all to follow up here.
Great. Thanks for that to get us going, Celenda. Bob, I'm going to come to you. What can you tell us about the bipartisan nature of the findings from this year's survey? What additional insights did we gain from the focus group as part of this year's data?
Well, thank you for allowing me to be a part of this very important research. And it's always a pleasure to work with Celinda and her team. Nice to get to know the folks at the Hunt Institute, including the governor. In terms of the bipartisan or nonpartisan nature of these findings, we don't really see much space between the two parties. The Republicans and Democrats hold very similar views on all of the issues that, with the exception of vouchers and taxes. But even there, you see that the Republican voters and the Republican leaders, both in Congress and state legislatures, are out of step with where their voters are. They're out of step with where the people that they purport to represent really feel in terms of the issues. So Linda hit on a couple of issues that I wanted to go back to in terms of the investments in education and give you some partisan numbers on that. For instance, of the 82% of the voters that favor providing mentorship, professional development opportunities, and leadership pathways for teachers, 84% of Democrats and 81% of Republicans hold that point of view. So again, very little separating the two parties. Again, 84 Democrat, 81 Republican. If you look at the 70% of voters nationwide that strongly favor, when you look at those that both strongly and somewhat favor, 93% of Democrats, 86% of Republicans hold that point of view. So there, again, we're not seeing much space at all. And the governor can certainly speak to this, but I don't know a candidate anywhere in the world that wouldn't want to have 86% job approval or 86% of the vote. They might like 93 better, but the difference between 86 and 93 really doesn't matter when the numbers are that strong. In terms of the 68% who strongly agree our public school teachers need resources, there again, we're seeing very strong bipartisan support for that. 90% of Democrats, 88% of Republicans agree that our public school teachers need resources. As Celinda mentioned, in terms of voters parting with their money for to increase funding for public education, 67% overall favor versus 24% oppose. We begin to see a little bit of a break here. 78% of Democrats and 57% of Republicans favor providing more increased funding for public schools. Again, 57% of Republicans are willing to part with their money to increase funding for public schools. Completely and totally out of step with where members of Congress and the Senate and state legislators are in terms of, any tax is a bad tax. Here, the voters are speaking, and again, 57% are saying that they are willing to pay more for education. In terms of the school choice and a tax increase are really the only places in this data where we see any sort of division between Republicans and Democrats. In terms of the voucher, 49% of Democrats support, 40% oppose. Among Republicans, 54% support, 33% oppose. So you begin to see the two parties kind of spreading a little bit. In terms of ESAs, 54% of Democrats support, 59% of Republicans. So you're seeing plurality, majority support on both those issues for ESAs. In terms of what we learned in the focus groups are always great because we have the ability to ask why. In a survey, you really don't. We create a question in a survey and ask it. In a focus group, we have the ability to pivot. If one of the participants says something that we want to follow up on, that we want to dig a little deeper, we can do that. In a survey, you can't do that because you want to ask the same set of questions to the entire sample. So we always learn something at focus groups, whether it's education, or whether it's choice, or whether it's whatever the issue. It allows us to fine tune the survey instrument by taking what we learn and converting that into questions based on the knowledge that was expressed in the focus groups. So, I think I speak for Celinda. We love doing focus groups because we always learn something. Sometimes we learn that we wish we hadn't asked that question, but you always learn something at focus groups. So they were very beneficial in helping construct the survey instrument.
Thanks for that overview, Bob. Celinda, I'm going to come back to you before I engage the governor. What were the top policy priorities in this year's survey?
The top policy priorities were really fascinating, in part because they show the appetite that people have for investment. If we look at the next slide, there was just very, very, very broad agenda here. But the absolute top issues were ensuring public schools are free of guns and other physical violence, which really came up in our focus groups a lot as well. Students not reading at grade level, ensuring public schools are free of bullying, including cyberbullying, not teaching real world skills for the future workforce, a huge, huge issue. And then also lack of quality teachers. And you can see here, for the most part, people thought the things that were very big problems were also the things that were most important. The one exception being the lack of quality teachers. What was very interesting here is there were not major differences between parents and non-parents. There were not major differences by party, and there were not major differences by region. The gun safety a little bit varying by region and intensity. But basically, you want to look for a bipartisan agenda. Who would have thought, given the wars that we've had with school boards, et cetera, in the last few years, education is a bipartisan agenda. And I think, and I'll be interested in what Governor Wise has to say, voters are going to take this to their gubernatorial races. They're going to take it to their state legislative races in 2026. They're very, very committed. The one change that we did see was not teaching real world skills for the future workforce. This is something that has actually increased by 10 points in terms of being a problem, and is something that people really unites Americans. They are one of the biggest changes we saw was the increase in concern about mental health and the increase in desire for teaching real world skills, having career and technical training, having programs that bridged high school and community colleges or certificate training, et cetera. This is a huge agenda with the public. If we look at the next slide, you can see the policy proposals that tested the best. The light blue is the total who favor the policy. The dark blue is the strongly favor. These numbers are so high. These aren't really policy debates in the public's mind. These are our core values. And as Bob said so eloquently, there isn't a politician out there that wouldn't kill for approval as high as these policies are approved. The top ones are teaching skills like communication, decision-making, financial literacy, and personal responsibility. Ensure every teacher has the development, resources, and support they need to do an outstanding job. Increase job skills and workforce training opportunities in high school, like internship opportunities and apprenticeships. Those are extremely intense, extremely important priorities. And we see a couple of things emerging here. The support for teachers and the development of teachers, the workforce readiness and the ability to teach real world skills, including the hard skills and the soft skills, like things like decision-making, communication, personal responsibility. And then mental health, a very, very big priority as well. And people really in our data emphasizing the need for mental health for students, students emphasizing the need for mental health for themselves, and people also being very committed to mental health resources for teachers. So let me turn it back to you.
Thank you again, Linda. Governor, let me come to you. Given this consistency of these priorities, what does this mean for newly elected officials as they begin to set their agendas for the upcoming terms?
Well, first of all, let me just echo what Celinda and Bob have said. Since having won several of my races by only about 51%, anytime I can find an 80 to 90% issue, I'm there. And if I were a policymaker, particularly one who's just been elected and coming out of a contentious election, and also at the state level, I would take these to heart, because these are, and that was the purpose of the Hunt Institute, and thank you for doing this. Having performed these surveys, not only this year, but for several years, is to show where there is public support and to put wind behind the backs of those policymakers who really want to take substantive action. So a couple of key takeaways for me, if I were getting ready to plan the next state of the state message or plan my legislative agenda if I were a legislator. So first of all, first takeaway is what's been said. Education is a nonpartisan issue for the bulk of our voters and for our parents. As Bob has said, and Celinda has said, very little difference between R's and D's, Republicans and Democrats, or even independents. People, and so keep this nonpartisan, not partisan. So, and then I also, Gervais took these findings and put them into categories that I thought I could make a case for in a state of the state message or in a legislative agenda. And so let me quickly run through those. First of all, school environment. We've already heard strong interest and support for mental health. That's a hangover from COVID. Parents understand, particularly, and the public, that the mental health issues are still hanging out there. They were there before. COVID only exacerbated them, and we've not seen a full recovery. So mental health is a key issue. And then under school environment also has been noted, making schools safe from guns, safe from bullying, safe from cyberbullying. I know that when I was in office, I realized that learning will not take place in any environment where people do not feel safe, and that has only been exacerbated in the past year. So school environment, dealing with that, overwhelming both by the public support for those initiatives. Second category, academic. Developing real-world skills for the future workforce. Students need to learn career-ready skills. And incidentally, when you do that, that gets to the second point that was emphasized. The public also supports an emphasis on critical thinking, problem solving, and teamwork. So real-world skills can lead to any type of post-secondary, whether it's going to vocational school, four-year higher ed institution, community college training programs, but developing those real-world skills. And when you develop them, you're also developing those social skills, those emotional skills, those mental health that's so important. And finally, under academic, reading at grade level. 37 states have adopted significant legislation already implementing evidence-based practices for literacy that are supported by the science of reading. The key, though, is, and I'm going to get to this because this is my third category now, is implementation. What this survey, the focus groups show, is how do we implement, and some suggestions that the public is making is supporting very strongly. Hiring and supporting quality teachers. Celinda's already talked about that. Creating personalized learning and individual learning plans. That was in this survey, and individual learning plans. It makes sense to people. I want my child's an individual, not just one size fits all. An emphasis, and policymakers need to have an emphasis on implementation, because one thing that's been in this survey not discussed yet is that there's a net negative attitude to public schools. So how can policymakers push and support the implementation that helps the public appreciate even more and support the public schools? I call it moving policy. Implementation is about moving policy to pedagogy and to teaching practice. And finally, I do want to note the willingness to support increased funding. Taxes are less supported, as has been noted. I approach this, though, as a policymaker. That works, and that will work, but you have to show the plan that's behind the funding. And I just saw in this last election where bond issues and others that had a clear message of here's what it's going to accomplish, whether it's supporting higher salaries for teachers or upgrading our buildings or whatever. Have a plan. At the same time, you're going out and asking for increased funding, but the public will support that. So school environment, academic implementation, it's all in this survey, ready for packaging into clear policy agendas.
Thanks, Governor. We are being hit with a lot of questions, so I'm going to sort of table some of the questions that I had planned for you all because I want to make sure we address our audience questions. A couple questions. I can see several questions have come through regarding the president-elect's sort of thoughts or talk of closing the Department of Education. I'd rather not go down that rabbit hole. I think we could probably get to it with some of the questions. So I'm going to do my best to try to address that since so many people, I've seen 3 or 4 questions just around the closing of the department. But there is one question regarding the support that is clear. You know, Celinda and Bob, you and both of you spoke about the support of vouchers and ESAs and sort of the polling of likely voters that came from this iteration of across the aisle. But concurrently, school choice ballot measures were being defeated fairly soundly. This is from our audience member. So, what are your thoughts about how do you reconcile that? And maybe we'll start with Bob and then Celinda, if you'd like to add to that, it'd be great.
Well, I think that, you know, as we consistently see on a number of issues, legislators are not always in sync with where their voters are. And in my mind, they need to put aside their personal agenda and their personal philosophy and do what's best for the student. And in some cases, that might be school choice. But they also need to take into account that on the school choice numbers, voters are pretty split. As I mentioned, 49% of Democrats, 40% support, 40% oppose. It's not a wide gap there in terms of among Democrats. It's certainly wider, 54 to 33 among Republicans. But I think that any elected official needs to tread pretty lightly on this issue because there's not unanimity of thought on it.
Yeah, I would just second what Bob is saying. I mean, 51% may sound like good support, and Bob and I have done a lot of initiatives separately and together. You know, if you only have 51% on an initiative, we would say, hey, you know, we have a deep possibility of being beat on this initiative, particularly if we're outspent or even have equal funding. Also, we posed that this would take money from we posed that it was public taxpayer dollars, but we didn't use the 2 issues that were most used in those efforts to defeat those voucher initiatives. The argument was used that it would cut money for public schools, which is different and much more opposed, and that those private schools and religious schools often didn't have to take every child and didn't have to meet the same standards as the public schools. And whether or not that's true or not, I'm just saying those were the arguments of the anti-side, and that was enough to shift a majority of people against most of the voucher initiatives that were out there.
So if I could just jump in on a 54% issue versus an 80 or 90% issue.
Yeah.
Yes, you may have public say, well, yeah, I'm a bare majority supports, but remember that legislatures operate have time constraints in what they can take up. And so do you want to be taking up the issue that barely has majority support, or do you want to be taking up the issue where people say this is a clear need, real career-ready skills, mental health, safe schools? Do you want to be taking that up and getting that one done first? My advice is always go to the issues that the public clearly supports and has expressed interest in getting something done, particularly if you have a brief legislative time to address it.
Actually, Governor, I was actually going to come to you since you were the elected on this panel. Welcome your thoughts here. You know, if you're looking at the presidential race, and Pennsylvania, obviously, you know, was a state that seemed to take up most of the airtime as the results were coming in. And there was talk, it's easy to Monday morning quarterback. There was talk of whether Vice President Harris should have gone with Walz or Shapiro. Shapiro's a Democratic governor in Pennsylvania who seemingly signaled some supports for vouchers and ESAs. So I think there is an emerging political voucher conversation happening with the Dems. And yet only a few percentage points. Pennsylvania was such a tight race. So yes, it's a small percentage, but is that small percentage, did it impact the race? And what are your thoughts there? And how do Democrats respond to this information moving forward?
Well, I've got two pros on this panel, Celinda and Bob, but let me just note as a former political candidate, my observation is education wasn't the issue that won or lost in Pennsylvania or any place else. It was rarely discussed in the federal campaign and the presidential campaign. And so I don't think education made the difference. I also would note on the issue of school choice, I think some of that, there has been some movements on that since COVID, because what parents began to realize was, there are many different ways that my child can learn. I think the bulk of parents and feel that strongly that there still needs to be a central place called school. There are benefits to school besides the programs that go in it. But I'm also reminded of a focus group, Gervais, that the Hunt Institute did maybe 2 years ago, in which one parent said, when we go back, I want to go back to normal, but I want to go back to a new normal. I want the building there, but I want what's going on inside it change. And so that, I think, can reflect maybe some of the feeling that's changing or shifting on school choice. But in terms of the election returns themselves, I defer to Bob and Celinda, but my sense is education just was not much of an issue, and rarely is it. It's not as much at the federal level, and I think that's important. These findings are going to be very important at the state level. I think they're important federally too. But the reality is that most of the activity and where most voters and parents and survey respondents think about education as being a critical issue is at the state and local level.
Thanks, Governor. So let me come to us. Despite 95% of voters and 96% of parents saying it is important that K-12 students get an education that prepares them for a career
better in
post high
Pennsylvania.
school. A majority of voters, 61%, half of parents, 50% rate the job schools nationwide are doing to prepare our children for future is just fair, maybe poor. So how can states and school districts increase college and career readiness? Celinda, maybe you could jump in on this one first.
Yes, and there's going to be an additional survey released on this topic with Dan Leeds, whom I know many of you know, and All for Ed. I just can't speak to how intense this issue is with the public. They are really, really in favor of it. And they don't want it just to be career. They want it to be career, technical, career, job. Some of the groups that are most important and battlefields politically, Latino men in particular, younger men, blue collar voters are wildly in favor of it. And people think it's a big solution. Not only is it good for the economy and good for the kids, but it deals with a lot of other things like absenteeism, a huge problem on the rise. If you tell kids you got to be in algebra in the morning if you want to be in that welding class in the afternoon, kids will come to school. Where they might say, buzz off on the algebra. I don't see where algebra helps me. Or they might find out in the welding class that they need algebra. So huge thing there, good for mental health. A lot of kids feel this is the one place they can let go. They feel like they're doing something important. They can produce something that it increases self-esteem. And I mean, there are many education experts on the call, but this is probably the most under talked about thing. And honestly, when we tested it for the Democratic presidential team, it tested off the charts. They should have been talking about it more. It's wildly popular. And I think every governor out there, every gubernatorial candidate, Democrat or Republican, should be talking about it because people think this is really popular and a really big idea.
I would just echo every word that Celinda said, that it's becoming more and more important that especially among parents, that students are educated and prepared for the workforce. And it could be something as simple as, I don't want my kid living in my basement the rest of his life or life. But I think that it's much broader than that. That parents and voters in general want a qualified and competent workforce as we move forward, and they don't necessarily see it happening, which raises the issue in their minds. If I could go back to the Shapiro versus Walsh question, as Celinda mentioned, education was at 3% in terms of the most important issue facing voters or up for elected officials to address. Economy on top, of course, at 27, immigration at 17, abortion at 10. So while education is an important issue, it's not in the top tier. It's really not even in the middle tier at this point in time, because there's so many other issues that have risen above it.
So if I could ask Bob, though, I fully agree on the terms of the presidential race, Bob, but at the state level, at least my observation has been in the past, is that that's where because people feel that the state government actually does something about education, and they feel that certainly the school board does something about education. So, I mean, I think is there a greater intensity at the state and local level on education than perhaps was measured in this poll, where people were probably thinking in terms of the national race?
I would say yes. I would completely agree with that.
And I think you may see it be one of the top couple of issues for every gubernatorial race. And at the state level, people also see the linkage, particularly like this workforce training, to the economy. This is something a governor can do for the economy. They think, governor can't get inflation under control across the board, but a governor can implement this, Democratic or Republican.
Yeah, and let me just say, as for a governor, if you've got somebody who wants to locate a sizable facility in your state, the first thing and I learned this one, they don't ask you first about taxes. They don't ask you first about the regulatory environment. They ask you first about the education levels, and then also how well trained is this workforce going to be if I move in here. And they're asking about the education system, not only for their workforce, but let's be frank, they're asking also if I'm going to move there, or if I'm going to ask my friends and colleagues in the C-suite to move there, what kind of education system will there be? The education system in the state is the strongest economic development incentive.
So maybe a question for all three of you. Bob, we'll start with you. You mentioned earlier our electeds. I don't think you were asserting all of them, but how do they put aside? They need to put aside their personal potential, their personal agendas, and really consider what the voters are really asking for. So when we think about parents and voters that continue to have these set of core values related to their priorities for public education, how should our officials be thinking about messaging their agendas as they look forward over the next few years? And Celinda, you referenced that some of these things are going to be off the charts, and gubernatorial should be advising. But how are you two as pollsters going to be advising candidates as they move forward?
Well, they pay us a lot of money to run these polls. They pay media people, they pay mail people. This is our career. This is, how we pay our mortgage. But if you're not going to listen to us, if you're not going to take the data to heart, why are you doing it? And you need to, as an elected official, you need to have a sense, or as a candidate, you need to have a sense of where people are, what they want, what their desires are. And, present company excluded, Governor, but elected officials are not always the smartest person in the room. And again, if you're not going to take the data to heart, then why do the poll? Why do the survey? Why do the focus group?
Before Celinda jumps in, I just have to say, Bob, one time I had a constituent look at me and say, Bob, you may always be wise, but you are not always so smart.
There you go.
Perfect.
Straight from the voters. Well, I don't know if we want to put up the slide, because we did do a lot of messaging in your survey work, and 3 messages really emerged that I think very, very powerful with the voters, and very powerful whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And you won't be surprised at them given the data that you've seen. Invest in teachers, invest in schools, and physical safety. And what's interesting is there was really some strong language here. Invest in teachers, invest in schools. Both started out with investing in our children is not a political choice. It's a moral choice. It's the right thing to do, and the right choice, and it's a smart choice. And then went on to enumerate what the investments could be. And frankly, you could follow this up with lots of different kinds of things. But, you know, boy, I wouldn't have thought moral choice was going to test as our top message in an electorate that's 40% secular, and an electorate that's 72% don't have children in school. And then the inclusion factor in the physical safety. Most of us believe that every child, no matter what they look like or where they come from, deserves a safe and welcoming school where they can thrive. These are really value-oriented. Next slide, there were 2 nuances also that parents added 2 additional messages to this. And they were, if we turn to the next slide, they were education is the great equalizer and our kids need to catch up, and nutrition. And it's interesting, one of the things that I'm sure is frustrating to everybody on this webinar, people are looking at the schools to solve everything, solve the mental health, learning problems, solve everything. But it was really interesting that high school parents in particular ranked this nutrition message as one of their top messages. So it was honestly, I think part of the reason education didn't register nationally is no one talked about it. But at the state and local level, people want to engage on education. It is really, really a strong force for them. It's a moral choice, as they say. It's an economic choice, as they say. And they're really committed to it for the future of the country.
And if I
And
could
we
just,
can take the slides down.
if I could just add
Please.
to both the invest in teachers and invest in schools, very, very little difference between Democrats and Republicans. Invest in teachers, 90% of Democrats, 89% of Republicans agreed with that statement. Invest in schools, 86 Democrat, 82 Republican. So again, very, very strong numbers. And you know, if you dive deep into the question, our public school teachers need resources in the classroom. We must equip every school with resources necessary. Voters get that with resources, you know, resources cost money. And even with that, you're getting 89% of Republicans and on teachers and 82% of Republicans on the school issue. They don't mind, voters do not mind spending or giving more money in through taxes or whether it's sales or property or whatever, to invest in schools, to invest in teachers.
And Hunt folks, if we had said to you, you know, you asked what was surprising to us. If I had said to you before this poll that education would be the most, I think this is the most bipartisan issue we've polled on recently, that education would unite parents and non-parents, seniors and Gen Zers, that education is a place where people would spend money as tax sensitive as they are today, I would have said, you know, I hope you're right, but I'm not sure you're right, that we're going to get numbers this high anymore, not in this environment. And yet we did. It's really, the public is so far ahead of the political dialogue right now. And I'm really glad and appreciative of Hunt lifting this up and providing people with the resources to take to the different forums that they participate in.
Yeah,
So go ahead, Drew.
I was just Governor, I was actually going to come to you because I think it's a good, Celinda's a great reminder of sort of the impetus or the genesis of the across the aisle work. I mean, it really was born out of the pandemic. We had superintendents and across the country, commissioners, and I know I see a few of them are actually on this webinar, so I appreciate them making time to be with us. But with all the funding that came, Governor, this is one thing you really talked a lot about, which was part of this, the impetus for this was all this funding came. A lot of superintendents were like, how do we spend all this money? They were just flooded with resources. Those resources have now faded. One of the questions from our audience is around there's a clear indication from the public of support for student mental health and school safety initiatives, but yet there's limited funding currently available for resources like counselors and SEL programs and conflict resolution. How do you think we might see funding increases in the areas to better align with what the voters are saying?
So I think it's important that policymakers actually pay attention to what the voters are saying, as opposed to perhaps what their perception of what's there's what is public opinion. And I think Bob Carpenter makes an excellent point: is if you're a public official that just paid for a poll and then you go out and you ignore the poll, what was the point? So if I were a public official today, particularly a state or local official, I would feel very confident putting together my agenda based on these areas that clearly the public is supporting. I think it's important to note what we haven't heard about in this discussion, but which was on this survey. And the reason we haven't heard about it is because it ranked so low. And those were some of the issues that have been the most controversial over the past several years, but which the public is saying that's not right, that doesn't rise to a key area of concern for us. And I'm particularly thinking of the issues around gender orientation, bathroom usage. The public says, yes, they want bathrooms. They have feelings about who uses what bathroom where. But in terms of is this elevated to a 90% issue? Absolutely not. The issues of critical race theory, the issues around curriculum and books. So these issues the Hunt Institute also tested, and Bob and Celinda can talk to the strength of these. But I was struck by the fact that that's not what the public is saying they think needs to be done. And Celinda pointed out in her initial slide, if you recall, she had what it is that people think is a problem, and then she had what is it you think is a priority. And in most cases, those matched up, and they matched up with very, very large numbers.
Thanks, Governor. Bob, Celinda, one of the questions, a few of the questions have come are like, where did you get this data as a national level? I know you spoke about this, you're breaking it down by different races and ethnicities, but you were also able to sort of sort this data from regions of the country. Did you notice anything uniquely different from parents in one part of the country versus the other part?
Honestly, what we noticed was the lack of difference. I mean, and it's kind of the point that Bob's been making. There were some minor variations. The Midwest, a little bit more concerned about safety, for example, the South as well. This came right after the school shootings there. The voucher issue, a little less popular in the West. I think coming from Montana myself, I think part of it is people wonder, like, what other school are we going to send our kid to? Like, what's available? So, and again, remember, 72% of voters don't have a kid in school. But what I want to, so nationally representative sample, likely voters in 2024. The other thing we did is it's called oversampling in our business, but I prefer to think of it as appropriate sampling. And I really, really want to commend Hunt because they've always been committed to put the extra money in so that we could break out groups like every region, like by ethnicity, by ideology. And this is a very, very robust survey. And if people have an interest in results by any region or a particular question by region or anything, be very happy to run that for them and put it into a memo or whatever you would like, Hunt would like. But again, my overall point would be very, very little regional variation, in part because there was very little variation underneath to begin with.
Bob, anything you'd like to add there?
No, I would just agree with Celinda and thank the Hunt Institute for allowing us to oversample or appropriate sample, as Celinda mentioned, because it allows us to slice and dice the data more. If if we had done 500 sample rather than the sample that we did, it would be hard to look at white women with children in a particular region, or it just allows us to again slice and dice the data more and really dive into the subgroups with some degree of confidence in those numbers. This margin of error for 100 is plus or minus 10. That's a pretty big swing. And if we only had 100 interviews, the data is not as compelling as this data because of the large sample size.
Thanks to both of you for that. So when we think about parents and voters talking about wanting to teach soft skills such as communication and decision making, uh, how does how how do we convey to elected leaders? I know we speak of this oftentimes within all of the different programs we have across the country, with from our Hunt Cain Fellows to our state legislative retreats. How do you go about taking this data as you work with your clients and your elected clients, and how do you break it down so they understand that this is actually something that schools need to integrate, and then therefore how are electeds going to ensure schools actually integrate these types of teachings of these important soft skills into the actual curriculum? Have you have you had to deal with that with any of your elected
Yeah,
clients?
we've had to deal with it a lot. Most of our electeds, just because of the nature of our client base, they're actually pretty committed to it. But they find it doesn't sell very well, or they think it doesn't sell very well, or they think it's going to be controversial, and it's going to get into some of the debates that Governor Wise was talking about. And if you can word it, in such a way that it's so general that the public doesn't know what it is, and then they rate it down less. They're not anti it, but it's like, what's that? That doesn't sound that important. When I think working overtime with Hunt, we found, first of all, if you include mental health in it, that is just, it soars. It's like one of the top priorities. And then what the innovation that we made in this polling that I think was very important was being more concrete, decision making, responsibility, communication, and also having people think it's all liberal stuff. Well, responsibility is not liberal. Frankly, I would say liberals are very responsible, but it's not particularly ideological. Doesn't everybody have to be responsible in our society? Don't we want our kids to be responsible no matter what? So that, including some of that. So I think over time working with you all, we have figured out how to express it, not in ways that trick people, but just in ways that inform people. Mm-hmm. And it's just important to know that people don't know what we're talking about. And if people don't have public kids in public schools, often they revert not to their own children's experience, but they revert to their own experience in school. It's a very weird psychological phenomenon. And so then their reference for the voters who are not parents can be really, really outdated. And then the last thing I would say is you have seniors paying a remarkable amount of attention to these issues now because they're really worried about how their grandkids are going to fare. And they also think their kids may not be raising their grandkids very well, but they know they'll never be invited back to Thanksgiving or Christmas if they voice that opinion. So they're trying to look, where can I inform myself about the school my grandkids are in? Can I vote for that levy? Can I do something? I need to make myself more aware. And they're really picking up now on these soft skills that they used to be very against. They used to be like, no, teach the basics, reading and writing and arithmetic, reading, writing, arithmetic. Now they realize, whoa, it's an entirely different world. And yeah, it'd be really good if these kids were getting these other skills that are vital to a successful life.
Bob, anything you want to add to that?
I would agree with everything Celinda said. And whether you're a parent or not, you're still dealing with the lack of soft skills of those coming out of the public school system. Whether it's at the local market or the pharmacy or even McDonald's or Burger King, the fact that many young people can't string together an entire sentence without saying the word like 10 times, or how can I be overdrawn? I still have checks. Just simple things like that affect us all. Are important, and the voters show that it's important in this data.
So if I could quote a school administrator about 5 years ago who I was talking about soft skills, and she corrected me and said, over here, Bob, we call them power skills.
Oh, nice.
Because that's what these students need. And also, to Celinda and Bob's point, though, calling it social emotional learning does nothing for you. That's gossamer. But when you define it, as was defined by the Hunt Institute in this poll, specific skills and also mental health, and guess what? Coming back to a point again, all of that comes under the umbrella of career-ready skills. And so that's how I think that we need to be talking about it. If I were an elected official, that's certainly I can give you quite an invention on. I think put together quite a presentation on an agenda on responsibility, teamwork, ability to solve problems, and solid mental health. Guess what I've just done? I've just defined whether you call them soft, power, or whatever. These are the skills that one needs today.
The other thing that Jesse, who's on the call and our lead on this poll, reminded me, voters say the most compelling reason to support policies that improve education is to enable students to become critical thinkers and problem solvers. And both of those lexicons, critical thinker and problem solving, really, really soaring in the data, because frankly, people think we don't have any critical thinkers or problem solvers anywhere in our society. So it'd be real nice if the kids could do that.
Governor, I'm going to sort of come to you as a closeout. Maybe you can bring us home. And I'm just thinking about this poll, and you and I recently were on, met with Laverne, Srinivas, and Carnegie Corporation of New York, but not for their support, this wouldn't be happening in 3 years. As a former elected, as a recovering elected, maybe, how, to me, I've looked at this data and over year, and there's so much consistency, and yet they're still so far removed from, as you guys, Bob, talked about the actual candidates and the issues. There's still a big delta, and I'm really heartened by the number of. I got a number of text messages yesterday from several of our fellows. Either they or their staff are going to plug in. This is always a data set they look forward to, and I'm grateful that we've been able to do it for 3 years. Look forward to doing the 4th iteration. Excited to see what next year's data is going to look like given the transition of presidents. But Governor, any thoughts, anything that really comes to mind for you as you think about, having facilitated and been part of this process for the last 3 years?
The fact that it has stayed so consistent. We started this process, of course, in the midst of COVID, and we wanted to see how people, or the public, was feeling about education in the midst of COVID, an unprecedented situation which nobody had ever been through before. And so we began asking these questions. And what I was struck by was, having run for office or been involved in helping people run for office for 30 years prior, I was struck by some of the sudden intensity of attitudes that had not existed before. Career-ready skills, for instance, emphasis on mental health, support for teachers, because the public began to realize, having sat at home with children for months at a time, the importance of the teacher, person known as teacher. And then to see the steady consistency over the last several years. And so while there's been a lot of ups and downs and some controversy in certain areas, what the public has been consistently saying is, this is what we need. And now we're at a point, we're out of COVID, We're past a very controversial election, and now we're at a point where there are 50 states and territories that have to put together legislative agendas, because let's remember, education, 90% of education spending is at the state and local level in K-12. And so now we're at a point where everyone has to put together a legislative agenda. Whatever happens in Washington or doesn't happen, it doesn't take away the responsibility of the governor, the state legislature, the state Department of Education, and all the elected school board officials, state and district. So this is a critical survey at a critical time to say this is the agenda that people really want. And people want results. We're not going to be able to run anymore on, well, it's been COVID, it's been a tough time, we haven't been able to make the gains we want. People now expect results, they need results, and they also see that this is critical for their economic future.
Thank you, Governor. Slinda, it's always good to be in partnership with you. Thank you for your continued work. Bob, thank you for your contributions this year. Look forward to reconnecting and the fourth iteration. As Slinda mentioned earlier, customized or tailored memos, reports. The full data set is on our website. Would encourage our audience to go there. We've put it out there for your consumption. If always with any of our guests, if you have any specific follow-up needs, you'd like to learn a little bit more, feel free to reach out via email or text. You know how to get in touch with me or my great colleagues. I know our director of K-12 is on, along with his deputy. So we're here to support you. Again, thanks so much to both of you. And Governor, always good to be with you. The next stop is Hunt Cain Fellows in DC for Across the Aisle. All right, everybody, have a good day. Take good care.
Thank you.